Curtis Lindbergh circled that John Deere 4430 3 times before breakfast. March 1975, dealer plate still on, $41,000 financed at 9.8% through Production Credit Association. He was 32, farming 800 acres of rented Nebraska ground, and this machine cost more than his father earned in his 5 best years combined. His wife Janet watched from the kitchen window. She knew exactly what he was calculating because she was running the same numbers. 6 good years to clear this debt if corn stayed above $2 and nothing major broke. That's the bet they just made. Here's what you need to understand about that moment. Curtis wasn't special. He didn't inherit wealth or have connections that opened doors. What he had was timing and the ability to recognize when everyone else's confidence created his opportunity. That tractor purchase wasn't about horsepower or a fancy enclosed cab. It was about reading the agricultural credit market correctly. And what happened next, over 10 years of commodity crashes, interest rate explosions, and hundreds of farm foreclosures, would prove whether he understood the game being played. The story I'm about to tell you is reconstructed from farm management records, Production Credit Association loan files, and county land transfer documents from Kearney County, Nebraska, covering 1975 to 1985. The names are changed, but every economic trend, every equipment specification, every land value shift comes straight from USDA reports and Federal Reserve agricultural lending data. This isn't a success story wrapped in sentiment. It's a case study in how capital-intensive operations survive volatility by making calculated moves when everyone else is making emotional ones. Curtis didn't start with advantages. His father farmed 400 acres, died of a heart attack in 1968. The land went to Curtis's mother, who remarried and moved to Grand Island. Curtis bought her out for $38,000 with a federal land bank loan at 7%. This was 1970, land running about $300 an acre. For 5 years he did what cautious farmers do. Rented another 400 acres, ran used equipment, cleared maybe $12,000 in good years. Nothing dramatic, just survival. Then 1974 changed the math for everyone. The Russian grain deal of 1972 had already pushed prices up. The Arab oil embargo hit October 1973. Suddenly corn that traded at $1, $10 in 1972 hit $2, $54 by harvest 1974. Wheat went from $1, $33 to over $4. Land prices started climbing 20, 30, 40% annually in some counties. Curtis watched neighbors discover they were sitting on assets worth double what they'd paid. He watched young farmers with college degrees borrow money for 1,000-acre operations and make it work because commodity prices covered mistakes. The Agriculture Extension Service held meetings about the new agriculture. Economists showed charts proving larger operations could spread fixed costs across more acres and survive price volatility better than small farmers. The conclusion was obvious if you were paying attention. Get bigger or get out. But getting bigger required capital. Capital required collateral, and collateral meant land. Here's what Curtis understood in early 1975 that many farmers didn't. The Federal Land Bank and Production Credit Association were looking at the same charts everyone else saw. They saw land values climbing. They saw commodity prices that made even conservative lending officers optimistic. They were willing to lend against appreciated assets in ways they hadn't 5 years earlier. Curtis owned 200 acres outright now, valued around $450 an acre. That was $180,000 in equity. Production Credit would lend him $40,000 against that equity for the John Deere 4430. It wasn't even a difficult conversation. So the tractor arrived in March. By April, Curtis was having a different conversation. The Sanderson place, 800 acres, 3 miles south, was going up for sale. Harold Sanderson had turned 72, no kids interested in farming, wanted to retire while commodity prices were high enough that farmland was actually moving. He wanted $400,000 for the whole operation. The land, a decent house, 2 steel grain bins, a machine shed, and a working set of equipment including a 1972 International 1066 and a 915 combine. Curtis looked at the numbers from every angle. Federal Land Bank would finance 80% at 9. 5% if he put down $80,000. Curtis didn't have $80,000, but his 400 acres were worth $180,000. Production credit had just loaned him $40,000. That left $140,000 in equity. He could borrow another $60,000 against that equity, giving him the down payment. His total debt would be enormous, $360,000 between the land purchase and operating loans. But he'd control 200 acres, own 800 outright, and have equipment capable of farming it all efficiently. The risk was breathtaking. If corn dropped back to $1.50, if diesel kept climbing, if interest rates jumped, if anything broke wrong, he'd lose everything. Curtis asked Janet what she thought. They sat at the kitchen table with pencil and paper running scenarios. She didn't say yes and she didn't say no. She said something smarter. If we're going to bet, we should bet when everyone else thinks it's safe. That's when the terms are good. Think about that logic. Most people bet when they're desperate or when everyone else is already winning. Janet was saying bet when lenders are confident, when terms are reasonable, when you can lock in conditions that won't destroy you if the market turns. That's not gambling. That's understanding how leverage works. Curtis bought the Sanderson place in June 1975. By harvest, he was farming 200 acres with one hired man and equipment that worked. The corn yielded 128 bushels per acre. At $2.20 a bushel, he grossed $282,000. After expenses, loan payments, and setting aside operating capital, he cleared $43,000. In 1970, he'd cleared $12,000 farming 400 acres. Scale matters when the market cooperates. Now here's where most people think the story goes. Curtis kept expanding, kept buying, rode the commodity boom, became rich. That's not what happened. What happened was Curtis spent the next 3 years watching the agricultural economy whipsaw in ways that destroyed farmers who made different choices than he had. In 1976, corn prices softened to $2, $10 a bushel. Wheat dropped to $2.30. Diesel hit 70 cents a gallon. The Federal Reserve, trying to control inflation, pushed interest rates higher. New farm loans were running 11–12%. Curtis's loans locked in at 9. 5 and 9. 8 suddenly looked like gifts. Curtis did something that seemed contradictory. He stopped expanding and started consolidating. While neighbors were leveraging their appreciated land values to buy more ground, Curtis paid down debt. Every extra dollar went to principal reduction on the production credit operating loan. By the end of 1977, he'd paid off the $40,000 he borrowed for the 4430. He still owed $320,000 on the land, but eliminating the operating loan freed up $4,000 a year in interest payments. Small move, massive implications. That $4,000 gave him flexibility. It meant he could survive a bad year without restructuring debt or selling assets. Then 1978 hit, and Curtis made a move that separated him from 80% of the farmers in Kearney County. The Federal Land Bank, watching inflation erode the real value of fixed-rate mortgages, started offering variable rate loans for the first time. The pitch was seductive. Start at 10, 5% instead of the fixed 12. 5% they were charging. Curtis could refinance his $320,000 land debt, drop his rate by 2 percentage points immediately, save $6,400 a year in interest. His neighbors were jumping on these variable rate deals. Curtis looked at the same offer and said no. Janet asked him why. He said something she remembered years later. They're offering this because they're scared of inflation, which means rates are going up, not down. They're trying to protect themselves. We should be trying to protect ourselves too. Curtis kept his 5% fixed rate loan. By 1980, prime rate hit 21.5%. Variable rate farm loans were running 15 to 18%. Curtis's neighbors who refinanced to save money in 1978 were now paying double what Curtis paid. Some of them couldn't make payments. The foreclosures started in 1981, not dramatic at first. One farm here, another there. Farmers in their 50s who'd survived everything: drought, grasshoppers, commodity crashes, losing operations to interest rates they couldn't service. Curtis watched Bill Hendricks, who farmed 2,400 acres north of town, try to refinance his variable rate debt. No bank would touch him at rates he could afford. Bill auctioned everything in March 1982. Land, equipment, grain inventory. Curtis attended the auction but didn't bid. He knew Bill would never forgive him if he did, and some things matter more than opportunity. The Ralph Dresser place was different. Ralph had farmed 1,600 acres southeast of Curtis's operation. Decent ground, well maintained. Ralph had expanded aggressively in 1979, buying land at $800 an acre with an 18% variable rate loan. By 1982, he was done. Farm Services Administration took over the property. They listed it for $600 an acre. Still above historical value, but below what Ralph paid. Nobody was buying at that price. FSA dropped it to $375 an acre in spring 1983. Curtis called the Federal Land Bank. His payment history was perfect. He still had equity in his original ground. Could they do a deal? Federal Land Bank looked at his records. 15% fixed rate, but they'd do it because Curtis had never missed a payment. He borrowed $600,000, bought all 1,600 acres. His total debt jumped to $900,000. His total acreage went to 2,800. The math only worked if rates stabilized and commodity prices recovered. Curtis bet they would. He was right, but it took 3 years to prove it. Between 1983 and 1985, several things happened. Interest rates peaked and started declining. Paul Volcker's Federal Reserve broke inflation's back, but the cost was a recession that crushed the farm economy. More foreclosures, more auctions. More families leaving land their grandfathers had homesteaded. Curtis didn't expand again during this period. He consolidated again. He paid down the highest rate debt first. He maintained equipment so nothing catastrophic broke. He waited. By 1985, things were turning. Corn prices stabilized around $2, $50. Interest rates on new loans dropped to 12%, then 10%. Land prices had bottomed. Curtis heard the McGovern estate was selling 2,200 acres in 3 parcels. Kevin McGovern had died at 58. His widow wanted to liquidate. The land wasn't prime ground, but it was contiguous to Curtis's operation. Fair market value was probably $525 an acre. The estate wanted $600. Curtis offered $625 with the condition that the sale closed in 30 days with no contingencies. The estate attorney asked why Curtis would pay above market. Curtis told him something that reveals how he thought about these transactions. Your client wants certainty and speed. I want the land before anyone else realizes the market's turning. Paying an extra $75 an acre guarantees we both get what we need. If we negotiate down to market value, someone else might outbid me, and 6 months from now market value will be higher than what I'm offering today. The estate sold Curtis all 2,200 acres at $625 per acre. He financed $1, $3 million at 5% fixed rate. His total operation was now 5,000 acres. His total debt was $2, $1 million. His gross income in 1985, corn at $2, 78 oars, a bushel averaging 137 bushels per acre, exceeded $1, $9 million. After expenses, debt service, taxes and reserves, Curtis cleared $162,000. Let's stop and analyze what Curtis did over those 10 years, because the lessons apply to any capital-intensive business dealing with volatile markets and changing rate environments. First, Curtis bought the 4430 tractor in 1975 at exactly the right time, after prices had already spiked, when lenders were confident, but before interest rates went crazy. That 8% loan looked expensive in 1975. By 1979, it looked brilliant. Second, he bought the Sanderson land in 1975 when sellers were optimistic and terms were reasonable. $400,000 for 800 acres with buildings and equipment at 5% financing gave him a fixed cost base that didn't change when everything else went haywire. Third, he locked in major debt at fixed rates before the 1979-1982 interest rate explosion. This might have been luck or insight, probably both, but it saved him from the variable rate disaster that destroyed his neighbors. Fourth, he didn't expand during chaos. Between 1978 and 1982, When land prices were peaking and interest rates were spiking, Curtis consolidated. He paid down debt. He let others make aggressive moves. This is counterintuitive. Most people expand when they see others succeeding. Curtis expanded when others were failing. Fifth, he bought the Dresser property in 1983 at the absolute bottom of the market crash. $375 an acre for decent ground when it had been 618 months earlier. This required capital Curtis had because he hadn't overextended during the boom. Sixth, he bought the McGovern estate in 1985 as recovery was beginning, but before it was obvious to everyone. $625 an acre was above market, but Curtis understood where the market was going. He paid a premium to guarantee he got the land and prevent a bidding war. Seventh, throughout the entire 10-year period, Curtis maintained excellent relationships with lenders. His loan payment history was perfect. This gave him access to capital when others couldn't get financing. That matters more than people realize. Lenders don't just evaluate collateral, they evaluate reliability. Curtis was reliable even when broke, which meant they'd lend to him when opportunity emerged. According to USDA data, between 1975 and 1985, the number of farms in the United States declined by 11%. Average farm size increased from 420 acres to 441 acres. But in counties like Kearney, consolidation was more dramatic. Farms under 500 acres declined by 38%. Farms over 2,000 acres increased by 56%. Curtis's operation represented exactly what agricultural economists predicted. Survival and growth belonged to operations that could spread fixed costs across more acres, maintain access to capital, and weather commodity price volatility. But there's something else worth noting that doesn't show up in USDA statistics or Federal Reserve reports. Curtis succeeded in part because he was willing to take risks when everyone else thought it was safe. Buy in 1975 when the boom seemed stable, and willing to wait when everyone else was panicking. Not buying between 1979 and 1982 when the crash was happening required discipline most people don't have. This is a pattern you see in every major economic cycle. The people who build wealth aren't the ones who take the most risk or the least risk. They're the ones who take calculated risks when the risk-reward ratio is favorable, then step back when it's not. Curtis understood something fundamental about leverage. It amplifies whatever the market does. If the market helps you, leverage makes you rich faster. If the market hurts you, leverage destroys you faster. The key is locking in terms that let you survive when the market turns against you. By 1985, Curtis was 42 years old. He'd been farming for 17 years. He controlled 5,200 acres, more than 12 times what his father had farmed. His operation employed 4 full-time workers. He owned 8 tractors, 2 combines, 3 grain carts, complete tillage and planting equipment, enough grain storage to hold 400,000 bushels. His debt was manageable because interest rates were declining and commodity prices were recovering. The 1985 Farm Bill provided additional price support mechanisms that stabilized revenue for grain farmers. Curtis wasn't done expanding, but the foundation was set. Over the next decade, he'd add another 1,600 acres, mostly through lease arrangements with retiring farmers who wanted predictable income without management burden. By 1995, he'd be farming 7,200 acres and grossing over $3 million annually. But the transformation happened in those 10 years from 1975 to 1985. One tractor purchase in March 1975 led to a land acquisition in June. That land acquisition created equity that financed the next expansion. Each move created a platform for the next move, but only because the timing was right and the terms were locked in at rates that didn't destroy the operation when conditions changed. If you farmed during this era, you know what I just described isn't a fairy tale. You also know it isn't the whole story. Curtis dealt with equipment breakdowns, weather disasters, commodity price collapses in individual years, labor problems, and the constant pressure of debt that exceeded $1 million. But the framework Curtis built, fixed-rate debt, diversified acreage, modern equipment purchased at opportune moments, and willingness to expand when others were contracting, proved sound. The lessons here aren't just historical. Modern farmers facing decisions about $600,000 combines, variable rate operating loans, and land prices that seem inflated or depressed, depending on the week face similar calculations. The equipment is different, the scale is different, but the fundamental questions remain. When do you expand? How do you structure debt? When do you lock in rates versus gambling on variable terms? How do you maintain lender relationships that give you access to capital when opportunities emerge? Curtis Lindbergh's expansion from 800 acres with one John Deere 4430 in 1975 to 4,600 owned acres by 1985 demonstrates that agricultural success during volatile periods isn't about avoiding risk. It's about timing risk, structuring risk, and having the discipline to wait when conditions aren't favorable. If you think these stories matter, if you believe we should preserve the real history of how farms grew or failed during the most turbulent agricultural period in modern American history, subscribe to this channel. Share this with someone who needs to understand that agricultural economics has always been about more than just planting and harvesting. Leave a comment telling me what you remember about this era, what your family faced, what decisions defined your operation. These aren't just stories about tractors and land purchases. They're stories about how American agriculture transformed from a collection of small family farms into the consolidated capital-intensive industry we see today. Every acre Curtis Lindbergh bought represented an acre someone else lost. Every auction he attended, or didn't attend, represented a family's fate being decided. The history matters because the patterns repeat. Understanding how farmers navigated the 1970s and early 1980s provides insight into how agriculture works during any period of volatility. And volatility is a permanent condition of farming. That John Deere 4430 Curtis bought in 1975. He ran it until 1991, putting over 12,000 hours on it before trading it in on a 4960. The tractor that started everything ended up being one of the most reliable decisions he made. Not because it was the fanciest equipment available, but because he bought it at the right time, at the right price, with the right financing terms. Sometimes the tool you start with matters less than when you start, why you start, and how you structure what comes next.